So what Dugin proposes is that each country, or more precisely, each people, should build based on a code analysis of past ideologies, positive points and negative points. Each people should build a new political theory for itself, but to overcome liberalism, which showed that it's the actual incarnation of modernity, this new theory should necessarily be connected, linked to tradition. But tradition isn't a single thing, because Dugin isn't actually a perennialist like Guénon. Dugin thinks perennialism or traditionalism as a kind of meta language. He has a meta linguistic interpretation of genome and of perennialism. So they are actually not a single source of transcendent truth. There actually are many sources. The language, maybe by language, Dugin means symbols, symbols, concepts, and some specific ideas. Uh, so each people, each folk, or each Dasein als Volk has its own path to tradition, and this new political theory should be a way to give or build a political application of this connection between immanence and transcendence. It's the idea of building a politeia, a kind of Platonopolis, since Dugin also works with political Platonism. It's the idea of building a politeia that is true to a people's own roots and to its path to eternity, or transcendence, theosis, apotheosis, or whatever concept of salvation that each people has. So I think that, as a kind of summary, we can say that that's the real fourth political theory. By Western civilization, guys like Alain de Benoit, or even Dugin himself, when he's being more theoretically precise, he means mostly the Atlanticist, Anglo-Saxon
Yeah,
modern
the gay,
civilization.
yeah, the gay empire, the globalist American empire.
Yes, but basically, so we all considered, we all consider Portugal and Spain to be our, civilizational parents, but we don't consider ourselves to be an extension of them, because when the Portuguese and Spanish conquistadors came to America, when they got together with the Indians and later brought slaves, etc., they built something new. So even though we respect Americans as people, as citizens, as people with their own traditions and their own ways of life, on a symbolical level, we consider there's a kind of opposition, or a kind of natural opposition between North America as part of the Western civilization and our civilization. Obviously, North Americans can eventually, maybe even build a new civilization, and I actually think that would be the path to go, because Western civilization is dead and is going to take with it everyone they can. So we see there's a natural spiritual civilizational opposition that we can trace back to that old Schmittian or Duginian opposition between land and sea, between Rome and Carthage. And that's why, for example, and obviously for many other reasons, we use the idea of a new Rome or of a tropical Rome as a kind of civilizational myth or civilizational symbol, and we consider ourselves to be in a mortal struggle against a kind of new Carthage. So, and actually, Hegel wrote centuries ago about that for example there's a kind of natural opposition between North America and South America, especially Brazil, following that Julius Evola cased distinctions. If you have a warrior spirit, a kshatriya spirit, you will want to do something about it. You will want to fight even if there's no chance of victory. And this is actually something that Evola's uh, interpreters, like for example Freda or Adinolfi, they precisely write that Ride the Tiger isn't a kind of retreat, isn't cowardice. It's a kind of perception that the political struggle has a meaning in itself that shouldn't depend on pragmatic calculations of victory or defeat. Oh, we shouldn't fight because there's no chance of winning. We should fight now because we have a chance of winning. It's like and obviously Evola follows the Bhagavad Gita in this. We should fight because it's our dharma to do so. So even though obviously we need to have a strategy, we need to have tactics, etc., we fight not because we have a chance of winning. We fight because it's in our nature to fight.
I guess my problem, like speaking from a third positionist standpoint about Dugin, is like I have read Dugin quite extensively. I have Dugin to thank for a lot of my actual philosophical interests. I even have Dugin to thank for removing me of my lingering sort of libertarianism, especially with his ethno-sociological work, and then removing any sort of methodological individualism and making me think of various collectives as the basis of society, not as the individual. So in that respect, I do have a lot of love and a lot of respect for Dugin. However, I see a lot of his critiques of the third political theory, and I wrote an article on this people can find, although I'm reworking that article because I wrote it about a year ago, and there's some things I disagree with and I've changed my mind on now. But I feel like a lot of his criticisms of the third political theory and where he says the fourth political theory can alleviate or needs to correct is unfounded in the sense that he sort of strawmans or maybe he just doesn't understand properly the third political theory. For instance, he if you read, for instance, in like at least in English, the second volume of the fourth political theory, there's like an appendix which talks about which Dugin made, which talks about how the fourth political theory versus the third political theory views, like say, like the concept of the nation. And Dugin claims that the third political theory views the nation as like an objective factor, versus the fourth political theory has a subjective view of the nation. However, I feel like if you actually look at what actual NSDAP people and actual Italian leaders were saying, Italian intellectuals were saying at that time in the war interwar period, they actually had a much more subjective theory of the nation and race than Dugin gives them credit for, as well as Dugin, I think, heavily strawmans the various racial theories that were propagated amongst like the NSDAP, for instance. So I just feel like a lot of his criticism of like the third political theory is just unfounded, and that's why I'm not like I do like pretty much agree like every proposal that Dugin has, pretty much all of his philosophy. I just disagree that it's a radical departure from the third political theory. I just think, properly speaking, if you understand the third political theory in the proper way, then you see that it's much, much closer from the fourth political theory, maybe a few changes here and there, than Dugin actually gives it credit for.
I know, like, A. James Gregor does a pretty good job of, like, debunking, like, race with the National Socialists being, like, purely, like, a biological thing. Especially if you go through some of, like, other, like, party intellectuals or, say, Faith and Action. It says, like, the primary factor of defining race was actually consciousness, so it was, like, purely a psychological.
Exactly, and even if this is something that I've discovered is or maybe not I discovered, but something I've been saying is that Dugin's idea of large spaces of civilization, he gets it from a lot of places, but as you know, one of the biggest geopolitical influences on him is Carl Schmitt and his idea of the, I'm going to butcher the German, the Grossraum, or the large space, the great space. But if you actually look into it, where Carl Schmitt got his idea of a great space actually comes from the Austrian painter himself. And he developed that idea all the way back in like the early 20s. And Carl Schmitt didn't even start talking about that until like the late 30s, like until like I think April of 1939 is when he first developed publicly his theory of the large space. So in that way, you can see like the Austrian painter having directly influenced, or there's like one person in between the Austrian painter and Dugin with regards to influencing on geopolitics, if that makes sense.
I would
Well,
also argue that Dasein being authenticity, for example, like all those things that come from Heidegger, those are only like really compatible through like exceptionalism. And when I say exceptionalism of a people, it means basically I embody everything about it, because that's what makes you, it's what makes your people. And when you embody that, like for the German case, it's Volkish ideology, whereas the case of the Italians, it's Romanita. If that makes sense. For the Russians, it's Eurasia, which goes all the way back to the Tsars, Sternberg, the some of the Russian fascists like Constantine, for example, even some of the left Eurasianists like Ustrelov, who was like a Nazbol. So it's like very hard to define, but you can see continuity.
Dugin himself uses fascist thinkers, or a kind of post-fascist thinkers, or para-fascist thinkers, like the ones from the Conservative Revolution, or Julius Evola, or guys like Perón, for example, who was big friends with Oswald Mosley post-war. As a matter of fact, post-war Mosley also is a kind of proto-fourth political theory, with his ideas of a unified Europe, with his connections to Jean Thiriart, for example, or to Perón.
I would also say like Francis Parker Yockey probably as
Reamer,
well.
Yes.
Otto Ernst Reamer.
So, for example, I think that Dugin's criticisms apply to these major currents of thought, but the fact that he uses also some fascist thinkers as the basis of his thought shows that he actually pays attention to minority schools of thought inside fascist parties, etc. For example, even on an esoteric level, one of the biggest influences on Dugin is Hermann Wirth, who was the chief of SS Ahnenerbe. So, for example, he has studied hard this subject. In the 70s, he was member of a Russian esoteric group called, I think that it was the Black Order of the SS or something like that. So I think he's know his materials, but on one hand, he needs to be harsh on his criticism, even for example, to convince people not to stay on the third political theory, because it's a trap nowadays. Nowadays, it's just a trap, just like staying communist is a trap. So he needs to be harsh, but at the same time, everything that is interesting and good about fascism, Dugin takes it and brings it to the fourth political theory. But well, at the end of the day, sometimes it's just a naming thing.
Yeah, I feel like a lot of our I don't think because I think on like a policy basis or like a point by point basis, me, you, and Zolt probably agree on like 95% of the things
I
here.
still think he's third positioning, that he doesn't call himself one.
Yeah, yeah, that's because basically my thing is, why would you call yourself, if you can, basically only using if you stop time at say 1945 and you can use political ideas from that fascist era to basically come up with a fourth political theory, maybe taking a little bit from Italy, a little bit of Germany, from Romania, Spain, then why would you call it fourth political theory rather than just a more sort of unified third political theory? I think that's really our argument, we would say. I know Dugin does add a little bit more traditionalism. He has his own sort of Russian spin on it with his own special Russian truth, right? But I just don't see why you would say fourth political theory rather than just like, oh, this is just a more completed third political theory. I think that's sort of our main contention here.
I mean,
But my point is that just like uh, each theory is a kind of revision on the previous one, the fourth political theory, in my interpretation, is a kind of traditionalist revision. It's national Bolshevik and traditionalist revision on fascism, but it always the question always remain, when can you say actually that a new theory has been born? So I think this is a point of contention. I think.
Yeah, so I have this theory I kind of want to run across with you with regards to like Dugin. So I think that Dugin, in a lot of ways, kind of reminds me of like Oswald Spengler in the sense that in the sense that they're both reactionary in a similar way. Spengler, he has this sort of like almost like deterministic cyclical cycles of history, while Dugin, he famously says that the future is open, and there's just you just have to have a way to actualize if you as a people can sort of actualize yourselves and you can create your own future, right? So it's not necessarily cyclical, although he does believe in somewhat of a cyclical eternal return. But anyways, I think they're both reactionary in the sense that Spengler wants to prevent his group of people or a group of people from turning into a civilization, as he calls it, and keep them at the level of culture, which he views as this vital thing, that's something that it's good, whereas culture is decadent and it's prone to it inevitably must collapse. I think Dugin, in the same way, can be seen as a sort of reactionary in the sense that if you look at his ethno-sociological theory, where he starts with the ethnos, then it goes into the narod or the folk or the volk or the and then it goes into like civil society, and then and so on and so forth. I think that Dugin wants basically Russia with his Eurasianism, but also in general, I think he tells people that their own fourth political theory should be about trying to keep their civilization at the stage of the Narod or the Volk or the Folk, the stage after the ethnos stage, so the one derivative away from the ethnos, and not be something else like civil society or post society or I forget the other names he has. But do you think it's appropriate to view Dugin in that way as a sort of reactionary?
I liked your comparison because basically his criticism of the nation state or the national state is basically this one. It can be put side by side with Spengler's analysis of the civilizational stage, even though they are using different concepts, etc. I think that what Dugin's trying to project is a kind of empire able to restore a kind of normalcy. And since Dugin considers time as a kind of subjective aspect, as a feature of human consciousness, and not as something that objectively exists, I think Dugin considered it possible to, even though community will keep um, dialectically interacting with other communities, etc., but outside of a kind of line of automatic progression. Well, there is also the fact that Dugin, as an Orthodox, uh, maybe he's basically trying to build, the empire of the end of times or something like that. So what he actually thinks about on how should resurrected empire or community go on about itself, how it should develop, etc. It's actually hard to envision.
Yeah, I was gonna ask this. So, we had that debate that we did more like kind of like it was more like a conversation than debate actually with like infrared. But I remember sending you some of the stuff from that guy like regarding Dugin. So like part of having you on here to kind of like clarify what Dugin thinks. So All right. So, do you think that Dugin's views are like leading towards Marxist-Leninism? Is that's something that some MLs, kind of like Caleb Maupin, have been saying?
No, not at all.
I can think of one more big question I need to ask because you do have people who share this stuff. So, Brandon Martinez, the racist liberal king himself. A lot of these people will share quotes of Dugin saying that he wants to exterminate the white race and then repopulate Europe with non-whites, and that he wants like global communism. So I just want to hear what a representative of the fourth political theory has to say.
That's
And
very
this is probably
stupid.
going to get clipped, by the way.
It's very stupid because obviously, for example, Dugin's favorite thinkers are Germans and Italians and French. Uh, Dugin spent most of his youth basically reading European poetry and reading European philosophy. Um, uh, he traveled most European countries. There's some stuff about Dugin's relationship with some movements from Spain and France that I couldn't say publicly because it precisely would be the kind of thing that maybe if he said in Germany he would be arrested, for example, because he was rolling in the early 90s with some pretty radical nationalistic third positionist movements in Europe.
Pontiac
Uh,
boy.
yeah, Pamiat.
Russian national unity inside the Donbass ruling party nowadays.
Yeah, and in Spain, he was friends with the Sedadi guys, and Sedadi were the guys who were connected in Latin America with Miguel Serrano, for example. So he he actually loves Europe. Now, people take some quotes out of context from weird old interviews in relation to these immigration matters, etc. Dugin basically believes that Europe is for Europeans, and there's no question about that. He has written lots of articles in which he criticizes immigration. He supports, for example, anti-immigration parties in Europe. All his European allies are anti-immigration nationalists.